These are criminals. They're drug addicts. They're hurting our society. I'm glad. It's very difficult. They're not only marginalized because they're locked up and don't have access to the courts and NGOs. It's hard for NGOs to advocate for a change in the laws because just what Nima said. Nobody wants to seem like they're soft on crime because they won't get reelected.
And they can't even go through the legislative process because they don't have the power to vote. So it's only through the judiciary that they can even be heard.
Right. And U.S. prisoners, except in actually one city and one state, it's not a constitutional issue, it's a state issue, but even if they did, they're not much of a voting bloc, and and that's basically they don't have the guts to do it.
Didn't they recently overturn, though, the discrepancy between crack and powder?
They didn't overturn it. There's been an adjustment in the guidelines, but that's after almost 15 years of hard work by NGOs, especially an NGO called the Sentencing Project in the U.S., to try to, and the Obama administration has seemed a little more open to it. And in my home state, the primary motivation among the legislators.
Could it be challenged as an equality clause?
I'm sorry, what?
The crack cocaine and the powder cocaine sentencing is different. Could be challenged as an equality protection clause?
It's a different. Well, no, but that would be a long discussion. So, but the answer is no, isn't it? Constitutional. They tried, but it was brought as a racial disparity issue, and that was lost. The legislature has a lot of discretion to decide the punishment for a variety of different crimes. In my home state, the governor, who is not up for re-election, has pushed very hard for changes in the mandatory drug laws and has commuted the sentences in some cases that I've worked on, and the state of Michigan is under difficult economic times lately. Her motivation is, I've talked to her, she could care less about prisoners. Governor Granholm, I'm looking at Harjeet because he goes to school in that state. She's a former prosecutor, and there's nothing wrong with that, but she said, I don't care about these people. It's too expensive. Drug treatment costs about $12,000 US a year on average. To keep someone locked up costs almost between $25,000 and $30,000 US. So you do the math. We don't have the money anymore to do this, even though, and so that's what's generating this. Yeah.
Well, it's not even. I mean, there are a lot of other costs beyond just the direct math of how long we incarcerate somebody, because what's happening in a lot of African American and inner city communities is that multiple generations now have had their fathers removed and placed in the prison systems, and then of course then the young men grow up without fathers, which of course perpetuates the cycle, and so you have what you have in the United States now, which is this huge gang and criminal culture in the inner city that's glorified and seemingly deeply entrenched because the family structure has been completely destroyed.
And as a follow-up to that, if the family structure is destroyed, the state then has to pay for certain social welfare services to put the child in foster care, which is not necessarily the best thing, and that's expensive, and it just spins off, and then the child, not surprisingly, ends up not being well educated and trained. And in some communities, when I worked in Washington, D.C. and in Baltimore, when the auto factories left my hometown of Detroit, there weren't jobs anymore, and a lot of people had to turn to that. Okay, John had mentioned some of the racial disparities in the female population, and this is approximately 10% of the U.S. population is African American. 40% of the female prison population is African American. 20% is Hispanic. Those are people who come from Latin America or Mexico who are a different ethnicity. So even though they're only maybe 15% of the population, they're 60% of the prison population. The numbers of women in prison are increasing dramatically and quickly, partly because of the drug laws. Look at the percentages. A woman of color, an African woman, 6 times more likely than a white woman charged with the same crime to be sentenced to imprisonment. Why might that be? Same drug, same problem.
Access to good lawyers.
That's an excellent point. And Kimberly.
There's a problem of racial bias in juries.
We have a jury system. If you have, it may be that they believe that somebody who is a minority involved in drugs should be taken out of society.
A lot of African Americans, are victimized more by the police, where they're pulled over a lot more, and their rights they're not as aware, I would say, a lot of the time of their rights to assert the right to be free from search and seizure and all that, and they just let themselves be searched.
I can tell you in Detroit, in Baltimore, and Washington, D.C., just in New York, all places that I've lived and worked, the drug trade is on the streets. Young boys, Dr. Nair last night was talking about the exploitation of children. In the drug trade, that's common. You have a 12-year-old boy stand on the street selling crack cocaine. It's not the person who's getting the money. He's sitting upstairs. He's not going to get arrested by the police. The boy has to then bring the money to him. The police drive down the street. Who gets arrested? The guy upstairs in the apartment or the boy on the street? And oftentimes they're juveniles, and oftentimes they're pushed into the adult criminal system. And that's we can talk more about that later. And women have gotten more and more involved, partly because the drug use has increased, and partly because they are also used in the sale and as couriers of drugs, and what we call the drug kingpins, the people who are really making the money, they're not out on the street. They're not getting arrested. If the police want to show that I've had 100 arrests this month and I should be promoted, you can just drive down to this one corner in Baltimore and make what they call a drug sweep, and you make your quota like that. And in the investigation that's required to go after the kingpins, I had a client, and this case went to the U.S. Supreme Court, who her boyfriend, who was much older, she was 19, had a young child, was a drug dealer. He was in his 40s, he owned some businesses, and the Detroit police were focused on him. She happened to be in the car when he was pulled over. In the trunk was a quantity of heroin. Michigan had passed the most severe drug penalty law in the nation, which meant that if possession alone over a certain amount, 650 grams, was automatic, non-parolable life sentence. The judge has no discretion. And she, because of pressure from her boyfriend, and her boyfriend's lawyer also represented her. The prosecutor said, you can do 2 years if you testify against this drug kingpin, which is who you were focused on. We didn't even know who you were, and you just happened to be in the car. What do you think that does that raise any ethical issues? What do you think the lawyer, can the lawyer advise this woman to go, to cooperate with the police to protect herself, which will hurt the drug kingpin when he's representing the drug kingpin? What do you think his advice was? We're not taking the plea. We're going to trial. They both ended up getting, and the appellate court in this case called her a kitten. You know, you all know what a kitten is? You know, a baby cat, caught in a tiger trap. The tiger trap was for the big drug traffickers, but they're gobbling up little kittens, and that's who's doing the time, because the tigers have the money for lawyers that can do a better job, and who and because they insulate themselves, they use other people and put them at risk. They don't get caught up in it because they're smart, because they're businessmen. Abuse. These are issues I talked about before. It comes up over and over again. In my home state, there were 30 prisons. 28 of them were for men, 2 for women, because the numbers are smaller, and they're spread in across. One's in one part of the state, one's in a totally different part of the state, away from where most of the women come from. And the women staff of the prison, the guards, were not to be promoted. Either they had to be able to work in what's called the living area. You have to do certain kinds of jobs before you get promoted to a higher level. Having 2 women prisoner in the whole state, what does that put the woman guard in a position of doing? What choices does she have to make? I have to leave and move 400 kilometers away from my family just so I can be promoted in my job. And so a lawsuit was brought on equal protection grounds, saying that if men are going to get promoted in this fashion, I have a right in the men's prison to do the same job as a matter of employment law. Guess what happened after that? What do you think? The male guards also brought a lawsuit after that. And they claimed that I have the same right to work in the women's living area, because the women guards do, even though they have much more. They have 28 different prisons to choose from, even in the women's prison. And the court upheld that under equal employment statutes in the U.S. What problems would arise from that? We're all adults here. Feel free to. We're not talking about guards up on the tower. We're talking about in the area where the women sleep, shower, change.
Well, as you mentioned, most of these women prisoners have previously been victims of abuse, and so having these men in authority telling them what to do in vulnerable positions leaves them open to attack again.
So they're terribly frightened all the time, which maybe ends up in suicide or depression, and sexual harassment and rape. And if a woman prisoner, and this was an issue in my home state Supreme Court, if a woman prisoner agrees that this is not forcible rape, it says, yes, I will have sex with this male guard, I'm in love with him. Is that rape or not? What do you think?
Because of the inherent relationship with
What's that?
I think because of the inherent relationship with the parties. You have one person who's by nature, having some kind of coercive power over the prison.
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
As per the 375, like we say, it's because he is in an influential position.
We don't, in most states, there's what's called an age of consent. We say that if a 20-year-old man had sex with a 15-year-old girl and the girl said, I consented to it, the law is you are too young to consent to it. It's still rape because you're not old enough to make an informed decision. We're protecting children. In the prison context, the argument was, can there be consent? And the Supreme Court held that in this, what they called an inherently coercive atmosphere, when there's a disparity in power, that consent is not a defense. There can be no actual consent. If the woman leaves the prison and wants to have a relationship with the guard outside the prison, that's nobody's business. It's certainly not the court's business. But inside this institution that's run by the state, and so even in that situation, you can, with some people, oh, that's not rape. And she agreed to it. And why might a woman, what would be some of the circumstances that would lead to that kind of relationship?
Privileges, some certain kind of freedoms that God could provide the prison if she acquiesces.
And one of the areas where those kinds of threats are made are, guess what? You want to see your child on a visit? You have sex with me. If not, you're not going to have a visit with your child. That was the most powerful coercive leverage that guards had. Or they would say, I'm going to write you up, which means I'm going to write a misconduct report. You did something wrong. It means you will not be released from prison as early as expected. And so that power, you want me to write you up? That's what they hear all the time. And what that means is not only will your visitation rights with your children be severed, you're going to be in prison longer and be away from your family. So there cannot be consent in that environment. I know I'm kind of blitzing through this, but majority of the women prisoners are mothers with children under 18. And again, I said they're the primary caretaker before they go into prison. 200,000 children involved. Again, the racial disparity. And how does that, as John said, how does that impact the social fabric of that community when there are no parents? What happens to these kids? Their parents become the gang leaders. And a lot of gangs, the gang work that I have done, they think of themselves as a family. And the young kids go there because they're seeking guidance from not so wonderful people. I'll put it that way. The women who are in U.S. prisons who have committed violent crimes, particularly the crime of murder, the vast majority of them are there for killing someone who has been abused them. And for many years, the law did not recognize that as a defense. Someone's abusing you, go to the police. You don't get to kill them. Sounds like it makes sense. What's the reality of that? Any thoughts about that? Kendall.
Women are afraid to go.
Why? The police will protect them. They have guns.
No.
Big, strong men. Come in and say,
It doesn't work that way. What the research by the battered women syndrome has shown is that they're in genuine fear to go. They fear for their lives. And the reason why we now recognize battered women syndrome is because we find that women, when they finally do pull the trigger, let's say, they typically are in fear of some sort of imminent danger. They think if they don't do it, they're going to be harmed sometime in the immediate future.
In India, is that kind of, if a woman is being abused by her husband, is going to the police something that's going to stop the husband from hurting her? I'm sorry,
And
what?
a family might go against you. Social pressure is a problem. In India, you look down upon if you work against your husband or against the institution of family. So your neighbors might look down upon you, and your in-laws could, pressurize you. And you'd end up getting beaten up or something like that.
Because of societal pressure also.
When I went into the prisons outside Pune and Tahar and talked to women who were there for the crime of murder, and this was a surprise to me, and Dr. Kumari said it's not a surprise. They were there for either the crimes, murder of their mother-in-law, or they were the mother-in-law who had killed the wife of their son. Can any of the Indian students speak to why that may be the case? It was news to me. It's a very different cultural difference. In the U.S., it would be typically against a husband or boyfriend.
Because of the joint family system, maybe. Because in India, when you get married, you move into your husband's house. Most typically, and then most interaction is between the mother-in-law and the daughter, because the men work mostly. That's the system. So that is why the conflict happens in India.
I want to hear from some of the Indians. If you have I'll go back to the U.S. model, but just why that might be. But I think she's explained it well. Harji?
I think a lot of the abuse is not just from the husband. Like there was a famous story about Una maybe. She was called the bandit. She was called the bandit. Essentially, she was gang raped and stuff like that. And she lived. Her husband allowed her to be raped and stuff by his brother. And she didn't just kill one person. She got every single guy one by one. And she 40 of them. And she was eventually elected as an MP. So if you think about it was, she had support from people too.
Jennifer, you were going to say something.
No, I just had a question.
Okay. No. Well, that's saying something.
The woman who killed their son's wife, is that what you said?
The women the majority of women and that Dr. Kumari told me about, and the ones that I interviewed, who were there for the crime of murder, had either killed their mother-in-law, or it's the mother-in-law who had killed the daughter-in-law. And she explained some of why that might be. Yes, sir.
I will say in North Carolina, where I'm from, battered woman syndrome is not recognized as a defense.
Let's first explain what it is. What is it?
Sure. As a defense, it's presented by defense attorneys when the defendant, the one person being accused of murder, has usually killed a spouse, a husband, boyfriend, who is usually physically but sometimes psychologically gone through this abuse. And over a period of time, they find this opportunity when usually, obviously, all the United States recognizes the right to self-defense. When the harm is imminent, there's another element there.
Well, even when it's not imminent, there are cases, and I worked with an NGO, a woman came into the bedroom while her husband was sleeping and shot and killed him.
No, but I'm describing distinguishing.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
Regular self-defense is when there has to be imminent, serious threat of harm. In this situation, the issue is whether that the threat is imminent, which is why North Carolina doesn't recognize it. One reason why is that the abusee, the woman, is at that time under no actual threat. And the counter-argument is that for the potential of abuse, you're making an excuse for someone taking the law into their own hands. But obviously the psychological evidence on their side is almost overwhelming. So it
was something that was developed over a long period of years. The psychologist said when the woman even when the woman who shot her husband to death while he was sleeping, she was not, as he said, in imminent danger, but psychologically he has beaten and hurt her and threatened to kill her and maybe tried to kill her so many times that she believes that she is in imminent fear. And that's something has to be recognized. And if the defense can prove that she has this psychological condition and that she acted as a result of that fear. It doesn't have to be imminent, it has to be the belief and oftentimes that is true. She may have been beaten the day before. She knows he's going to go out and get drunk on Friday. And guess what happens every time he comes home after he gets drunk? He tries to kill her.
So I mean, I'm just wondering, is that clear for like Indian students?
I'll explain. Okay, so the problem in India is, there are, one thing you look at the dowry problem. So essentially when you get married your son, the most of the time who demand more dowry is the mother-in-law, and therefore the friction is more with the mother-in-law and the daughter-in-law. And the husband, somehow newly married, still have some kind of a love and affection towards the wife. Though husband also many times a culprit, but most of the time it is the fight is between the daughter-in-law and the mother-in-law. Therefore, either thing happens, either the daughter-in-law may try to take a revenge against the mother-in-law for the continuous torture that she is undergoing, or the vice versa. Sometimes if the mother-in-law is powerless and she is completely depending upon the son's income, and the daughter-in-law may ill-treat her in the house. This is one reason. That's why if you look at the several amendments that were made to the Indian Evidence Act, now there are two provisions which says the moment a woman after the marriage but before 7 years, if she died in a suspicious circumstances and if the prosecution can prove that there is a demand for a dowry, the court shall presume that the death is a dowry death and the husband and the mother-in-law and the father-in-law is responsible. So that means the burden will be shifting on to the accused to show that they did not kill the killer.
Because in a lot of cases,
A lot of dowry death cases. And the irony is that in most of the dowry deaths, what they mention is the daughter-in-law is cooking something and accidentally the sari got fired and she was burned. But in fact, they will be pouring kerosene and setting fire. So that's why there is a famous quote from the president: why only daughter-in-laws die in kitchen accidents? Does it mean daughters doesn't cook anymore? So that's the reason why you could see the most of the time either daughter-in-law or the mother-in-law involved.
Does India recognize this battered woman syndrome?
Not really in legal sense, because if you look at the murder, one of the exceptions is sudden and grave provocation. But the sudden and grave provocation should be like your imminent danger.
Okay.
But there are instances where when a crime was reported and the court will look at under what circumstances that such a murder was taken place, maybe that is a mitigating factor to reduce the life imprisonment into, death sentence into life imprisonment.
I can tell you in Las Vegas, in that area where I live, and this is pretty typical, that the greatest, what do you think the greatest cause of death for women is? Cancer, heart failure. Any guesses in this context?
domestic violence.
Domestic violence. More women die from being killed by someone who supposedly loves them than in any medical condition or street crime. The fear is not, of course, we talk about the vulnerability of a woman walking alone out on the street. We even talked about maybe it's not good to walk at night outside of Ignu. But the vast majority of these murders are domestic violence with someone you know. And that is why this issue came up. Okay, medical care is one of the primary causes. Problems of women in prison. They have chronic health problems. Historically, because there were much fewer women in prison than there are now, there were no resources provided for them. Oh, they're going to be in for a year or two and we don't have to do much. Now we have, because of the drug laws, increased need, but it hasn't expanded, and it certainly hasn't expanded to the special medical needs of women. We talked about gynecologists. Many women come into prison who are pregnant.
In India also,
And the men don't. And I told you what the response was. Luckily, we had a judge who said, I can't believe you said that on the record, which means publicly in the court. But that was the state's public position on it. I'll start having a fit.
Can I just throw one quick thing too? There's an issue about, because many women come in pregnant and actually give birth while they're incarcerated, there's an issue about whether or not women need to be shackled. Do they need to have handcuffs and be like tied or handcuffed to a bed while they're giving birth, and whether or not the child should be allowed on their lap afterwards. And there's different, I think state to state it's very different in terms of, if some mothers are held down, locked down to give birth, the child's taken away, in some places it's...
In my home state, they are shackled when they... Are they a threat to the male guard standing there or outside the room? I mean, isn't that cruel or unusual punishment? I mean, up for you to decide. The other issue that comes up with what happens to the child. In some states, the child is automatically taken from the mother right then and given to the state to be placed in an orphanage or for adoption. It's different in different states. Even though the woman may only be sentenced to a year or two and has family that they could live with. This is, again, just some figures. I'm not going to, you might want to look through them about the tremendous increase in women prisoners. And the fact that we don't know we haven't come to any conclusions about. We looked at statistically women and men who were sentenced for the same crime, same criminal history. And my presumption was, of course, the man's going to get a harder sentence. It turns out to be just the opposite. And my colleague, Dr. Kumari's theory, and she has spent a lot of time in the U.S., is that the belief of the male judge is that this woman should have nothing to do with her family or children and should be removed from him, and he's trying to protect the children. I don't know that that's true. We haven't, but that's a theory. This is something we're going to talk about in small groups. What can you do as a law student about some of these problems? And there are things you can do. And I worked in clinics in law schools where they've addressed these problems, either through a formal clinic academic program, student volunteer, whatever. There's many, many ways to approach that. These are Dr. Kumari's figures on female convicts throughout different states, and I'm not going to... a lot of the similar problems is fewer women prisoners, but again, if the prison is far away from their home, they don't have contact. What I did find, which is not true in the U.S., when I visited prisons, and you'll see it in Tahar, is that the children up to a certain age are allowed to stay with the mother in prison. In the U.S., there's one small example in the state of New York, but I'd rather you break into small groups. You can look, but this is some of the information that Dr. Kumari provided about the situation of mothers in prison and the law. And some references if you're interested in taking it further. Okay, I'm going to shut up, and we're probably going to go beyond 11:30, but Professor Prasad is going to handle your small group exercise.
Okay, tea is also ready and it is waiting outside, so it's going to be